The secrets behind closed doors. Delilah March, a 40-year-old homemaker from Arlington Heights, Illinois, was known for her charm and effortless grace. Married for 15 years to Philip March, a respected lawyer, Delilah appeared to have it all: a beautiful home, two well-mannered children, and a strong marriage that was the envy of her neighbors. To the outside world, she was the quintessential suburban wife, always volunteering at the local community center and organizing events with her warm, inviting smile. She was known to remember birthdays and anniversaries, often leaving thoughtful notes on her neighbors' doorsteps. But as is often the case, there was more to Delilah's life than met the eye. Philip had a demanding career, often leaving Delilah to manage the household and look after their two children, Max and Ellie, who were in high school. She found herself drifting through the motions of life, increasingly isolated by the rigid expectations of her role. Loneliness crept in, leaving her feeling as though she was fading into the background of her own life. Despite her seemingly perfect marriage, she was struggling with the quiet realization that she wanted more, something different, something that allowed her to truly feel alive. This longing grew as she developed an unexpected friendship with Grace Thompson, her next-door neighbor, who had moved in a year earlier. Grace, a 37-year-old artist, had relocated from New York after her divorce. She was everything Delilah admired: creative, free-spirited, and uninhibited by the conventions of suburban life. Grace wore her individuality with pride, her house filled with artwork and eclectic furniture that spoke to her vibrant personality. Over countless cups of coffee and long evening chats on Grace's patio, the two women formed a deep connection that was unlike any friendship Delilah had known. It was during one of these late-night conversations, with the soft glow of string lights illuminating their laughter, that Delilah first felt a spark she hadn't anticipated. She found herself captivated by Grace's stories of life in New York, her unconventional views on relationships, and her refreshing honesty. Grace, sensing Delilah's curiosity, encouraged her to embrace life's complexities rather than shy away from them. One evening, as the autumn leaves began to turn and the air grew crisp, Delilah confessed to Grace how stifled she felt. Grace listened intently, her eyes warm in understanding. It was then that Grace leaned in, her hand gently brushing Delilah's, and in that moment, the boundaries of their friendship blurred. Delilah's heart raced, but she didn't pull away. In Grace's gaze, she felt seen, understood, and alive in a way she hadn't for years. That single touch was the beginning of an affair that would change the course of Delilah's life forever. The thrill of their secret meetings brought a newfound sense of joy and freedom to Delilah's life, but as the weeks passed, she found herself walking a dangerous line. The exhilaration was soon tinged with guilt and fear. She was terrified of what would happen if Philip or her children discovered the truth. To the outside world, she maintained her role as the perfect wife and mother, but behind closed doors, she was unraveling. Just as Delilah thought she could keep her secret life under control, she noticed subtle changes in Philip's behavior. He seemed more withdrawn, watching her with an intensity she hadn't seen before. Suspicion crept into their interactions, and Delilah began to wonder if he knew more than he was letting on. But it wasn't Philip who would confront Delilah about her affair. One afternoon, while dropping off groceries at Grace's house, Delilah was met by a stranger on Grace's doorstep, a woman with a cold, calculating gaze. She introduced herself as Meredith, Grace's former partner from New York, who had flown in unexpectedly to reconnect. Meredith was polite but unnerving, watching Delilah with an unsettling familiarity. As days passed, she lingered in the background of Delilah and Grace's relationship, making unannounced visits and inserting herself into their private moments. She claimed to be an old friend, but her intentions were anything but friendly. Delilah began to feel trapped, caught between the exhilarating bond she shared with Grace and the constant threat posed by Meredith's presence. Over time, Meredith's behavior grew more invasive. She appeared at Delilah's community events, watched her interactions with Grace, and even made subtle comments to Philip that hinted at secrets lurking beneath their marriage's facade. Delilah felt the walls closing in as Meredith's jealousy transformed into something darker. One rainy afternoon, Delilah was home alone, attempting to distract herself with household chores. She hadn't spoken to Grace since their visit to the police, each of them too wrapped up in their own fears. The distance felt like a chasm, deep and impossible to bridge, with Meredith's shadow looming over both their lives. Delilah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, even in her own home. She moved from room to room, checking windows and doors, until she finally settled in the kitchen, washing dishes just to feel the warmth of the water. A sudden, loud knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. She froze, her heart pounding as she approached the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw Detective Lawson standing on her porch, his face tense and serious. She unlocked the door with trembling hands, letting him inside. "We need to talk," he said, stepping into the hallway and closing the door behind him. "It's about Meredith." Delilah felt a surge of relief. "Have you found anything?" Lawson hesitated, his expression grim. "We looked into her background, as you requested. Turns out, Meredith has a history of harassment, restraining orders, even some minor assault charges. But that's not all." He glanced around as if ensuring they were truly alone. "She went missing 2 nights ago. Her car was found abandoned on the outskirts of town, keys still in the ignition." The words sank in slowly. Meredith, gone. For a brief, fleeting moment, Delilah felt a surge of relief, a hope that maybe, somehow, her nightmare was over. But then came the realization. If Meredith was missing, then she hadn't been behind the recent calls, the strange sounds, or the broken mirror. There was something, or someone, else at play. Lawson's voice broke her thoughts. "We don't know what happened to her, but it's strange. A woman like that, with a history of obsession, doesn't just disappear without leaving a trace." He paused, his eyes scanning her face. "Do you have any idea where she might have gone, Delilah? Anyone she might have confided in?" Delilah shook her head, her mind spinning. "No, I mean she wasn't close to anyone here. She was just following me, watching Grace and me. But that's it." Lawson nodded, his expression unreadable. "We'll continue looking, but in the meantime, I'd suggest you stay vigilant. And if you hear from her, or if anything unusual happens, anything at all, call me immediately." As he left, Delilah closed the door, her mind reeling. Meredith's disappearance should have lifted a weight off her shoulders, but instead it only deepened her dread. Now she had no idea who was behind the threats, no clear target for her fear. The unknown loomed like a dark cloud, heavy and suffocating. That night, Delilah tried to reach Grace, but her calls went unanswered. She left several messages, her voice tinged with desperation, but no reply came. Grace, who had once been her comfort, her safe harbor, now felt like a distant memory. And Delilah found herself haunted by thoughts of what Meredith might have done to her. She couldn't shake the feeling that Meredith's jealousy had spilled over into something more, something vengeful and destructive. Unable to sleep, Delilah wandered through the empty house, stopping in front of her children's bedrooms, listening to their steady breaths. She marveled at how oblivious they were to the turmoil just beyond their door. Standing in the quiet hallway, she made a decision. She would end this one way or another. She couldn't keep living in fear, waiting for Meredith, or whoever was responsible, to strike again. She needed answers, even if it meant facing the danger head-on. The next day, Delilah went to Grace's house, hoping for a chance to speak in person. She knocked on the door, glancing around the quiet street, feeling exposed and vulnerable. Finally, the door opened, and Grace stood before her, looking exhausted and weary. "Delilah," she said softly, stepping aside to let her in. They sat together in the dimly lit living room, both of them struggling to find the right words. Finally, Delilah broke the silence. "Grace, we need to talk. Meredith, she's missing." Grace's eyes widened, her hands trembling slightly. "Missing? What? What do you mean?" "She vanished 2 nights ago. The police found her car, but she was gone. Delilah watched Grace's face, searching for any sign of relief or guilt, but found only shock and fear. Do you think she could be behind the threats?" Grace's voice was barely a whisper, as if she were afraid to speak the words aloud. "I thought so," Delilah admitted, her voice cracking. "But now, I'm not sure. If she's really gone, then who?" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. They sat in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Grace reached out, taking Delilah's hand in hers. "We're in this together, Delilah. No matter what happens, we'll face it together." The next day, Delilah returned home from running errands to find her bedroom mirror shattered. Scrawled across the broken glass in red lipstick were the words, "You'll lose everything." Her hand shook as she backed out of the room, her mind reeling from the threat. This wasn't jealousy anymore. It was a promise of destruction. Desperate and unsure of what to do, Delilah finally decided to tell Philip the truth. She rehearsed her confession a dozen times, trying to find the right words. But when he walked through the door that evening, exhausted and oblivious, her courage faltered. How could she shatter his trust, ruin their family's stability, over a threat that might not even be real? That night, Delilah's mind was a war zone of guilt and fear. She lay in bed beside Philip, wide awake, dreading the moment Meredith would strike again. She was trapped in her own web of deceit, terrified that each day brought her closer to losing everything she held dear. As the weeks went by, the harassment continued. Every day brought a new torment: vandalized garden furniture, strange messages left on her voicemail, and even her favorite family photos mysteriously disappearing from the house. Delilah's nerves were fraying, and she knew she was reaching her breaking point. One evening, as she sat alone in her car in a quiet parking lot, Delilah decided she couldn't go on like this. She dialed Grace, her hands shaking, and told her, "I can't do this anymore. Grace, I'm losing my mind. She's everywhere. She's destroying my life." Grace hesitated before replying. "Delilah, I know this is hard, but we can't let her win. I've been trying to reason with her, but maybe it's time we go to the police." Delilah's initial instinct was to reject the idea. How would she explain the affair, the lies, the tangled mess of it all? But as she sat in the silence of her car, staring at the darkened streets around her, she realized there was no other choice. Meredith's threats were escalating, and Delilah feared what might happen next. That night, Delilah and Grace walked into the police station together. Detective Mark Lawson, a seasoned investigator with sharp instincts, listened patiently as Delilah recounted the harassment, the threats, and her affair with Grace. She watched as his face shifted from understanding to concern, his eyes narrowing as he took notes. "Stalking cases can be complex," he explained, "especially without direct evidence, but we'll do what we can. If Meredith has a history of this behavior, we may be able to issue a warning or set up surveillance." Delilah felt a flicker of relief. Finally, someone was taking her seriously. Detective Lawson promised to investigate, but warned her that proving Meredith's involvement wouldn't be easy. As they left the station, Delilah felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps with the police involved, Meredith would finally back off. But she was wrong. Later that night, as she settled into bed, her phone chimed. A new message appeared, sent from an unknown number. The message read, "You went to the cops. That was a mistake." Delilah's blood ran cold. She clutched her phone, paralyzed by fear. The police were supposed to be her protection, but Meredith had already found out. Her threat was still looming, closer and more dangerous than ever. Delilah realized that she was no longer just fighting to keep her affair a secret. She was fighting to protect herself, her family, and the life she had built. And it seemed that Meredith was willing to go to any lengths to make sure Delilah paid the price. The abyss opens. In the days following Delilah's visit to the police, the tension in her home grew unbearable. Her every move was shadowed by a gnawing fear that Meredith was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Detective Lawson had promised to monitor the situation, But Delilah had received little reassurance beyond the occasional, "We're looking into it." Each day, the silence from law enforcement made her feel more exposed, vulnerable, and isolated. Philip, noticing her anxious behavior, grew concerned. "Delilah," he asked one night over dinner, "you've been acting strange lately. Are you feeling okay? Is something wrong?" Delilah forced a smile, assuring him that everything was fine, brushing off her sleepless nights and pale face as just a bit of stress. But she knew she was reaching a breaking point. She couldn't keep lying, not to Philip, not to herself. The truth was, she was terrified, and without a clear way to escape the grip of Meredith's relentless jealousy. One evening, after a tense encounter with Meredith at Grace's house, Delilah returned home shaken. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, watched from the shadows by someone who knew everything about her hidden life. As she approached her front door, she noticed a single note slipped between the doorframe. A message scrawled in bold letters, "Secrets have a way of catching up to you." The note was signed simply, M. Delilah's pulse quickened as she looked around, the silence of the suburban night now heavy with fear. She realized that the life she had built, the secrets she had hidden, and the love she had found in Grace were all on the verge of unraveling, and the consequences could be deadly. Shadows in the suburbs. After finding the ominous note on her doorstep, Delilah felt the weight of her double life pressing down harder than ever. She couldn't sleep, replaying her last encounter with Meredith in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she could picture Meredith's piercing gaze and remember her strange, mocking smile. That note, so simple yet so loaded, became an invisible chain around Delilah's heart. Every creak in the house, every ring of the phone, even the familiar rustling of the trees outside her window seemed to carry a sinister undertone. But the next morning, Delilah resolved to go about her day as usual. She couldn't risk letting her family see her unravel. She prepared breakfast, packed her kids' lunches, and went through her routines with a forced smile. Yet, her mind was clouded with suspicion and fear. As she drove past Grace's house on her way to the grocery store, she noticed Meredith's car parked out front. The sight twisted her stomach. What was Meredith's endgame? Was she here to drive a wedge between Delilah and Grace, or something worse? That afternoon, Delilah gathered the courage to confront Grace about Meredith. She texted her, suggesting they meet at their usual spot in the park. Grace arrived, looking troubled and distant, but Delilah couldn't afford to hold back any longer. She blurted out, "Grace, who is Meredith really? And why is she still here?" Grace glanced away, fidgeting with her hands. She's my ex," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "We ended things over a year ago. But when she heard I moved here, she showed up, saying she wanted to patch things up." "But it's more than that, isn't it?" Delilah pressed, her voice trembling. "She's been watching us, following me. She left a note at my house. This isn't just some friendly visit, Grace." Grace's eyes widened, and she looked genuinely shocked. "A note? I didn't know. She's always had a possessive streak, but I never thought she'd take it this far." She reached out, her hand resting on Delilah's shoulder. "Delilah, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to drag you into this." Delilah tried to take comfort in Grace's touch, but the doubt lingered. Meredith's intentions felt darker than simple jealousy. Yet, Grace assured her that she would confront Meredith and set firm boundaries. Delilah clung to that promise, hoping it would be enough to keep Meredith at bay. But things only grew worse. Over the next week, Delilah began receiving unsettling phone calls, moments of silence followed by a faint, unsteady breath on the other end. She blocked the number, but the calls persisted from different numbers. She found strange footprints outside her bedroom window, and once, when she returned home, the front door was slightly ajar. Though nothing seemed out of place, she felt violated, as if her private world was being invaded piece by piece. One night, while Philip was away on a business trip, Delilah lay awake in bed, her mind racing with fear and dread. Suddenly, she heard a faint scratching sound outside her window. Her heart pounded as she held her breath, hoping it was just her imagination. But then, the sound grew louder, more insistent, and a shadow passed by the window. Panicking, she dialed Grace, her only lifeline in this nightmare. Grace answered groggily, but when she heard Delilah's voice trembling with fear, she was wide awake. "I'm coming over," she said. "Don't move, Delilah. Lock the doors and wait for me." 15 minutes later, Grace arrived, her eyes fierce with determination. She examined the area around the window, noticing faint marks on the glass. "Meredith," she muttered almost to herself. "She's going too far." They spent the rest of the night talking, Grace comforting Delilah, whispering reassurances that she would handle Meredith. For a brief moment, Delilah allowed herself to believe that everything would be okay, that Grace would keep her safe from this nightmare. But the peace was short-lived. For a moment, Delilah felt a surge of hope, a reminder of the bond that had drawn them together in the first place. But as she left Grace's house that evening, her mind returned to the threats, the feeling of being watched, and the terror that still lingered. She was no closer to finding answers, and the unknown felt more dangerous than ever. That night, Delilah was awoken by a loud crash from downstairs. Her heart raced as she climbed out of bed, her mind already racing with worst-case scenarios. She grabbed her phone, ready to call the police, but then she stopped. She was tired of being afraid, tired of running. She needed to know what was happening, and she couldn't hide forever. Slowly, she made her way downstairs, her footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor. The living room was dark, but she could make out a figure standing near the shattered window. Her heart pounded as she recognized the figure. Philip. He turned, his face pale and eyes wide with shock. "Delilah, I didn't mean for you to see this." She stared at him, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. "Philip, what are you doing?" He hesitated, his hands shaking. I thought you were having an affair. I wanted to know the truth. So I hired someone to watch you, to keep an eye on you." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. You did this. The calls, the notes, the threats, that was you." He shook his head, his face filled with guilt. "Not me, no. I hired a private investigator. I just wanted to know the truth. But when he found out about Grace, he went too far. He started harassing you, trying to scare you. I told him to stop, but he didn't listen." Delilah felt a mixture of anger and relief, her fear replaced by a burning rage. "You hired someone to spy on me, to threaten me." Philip looked down, his face pale. "I'm so sorry, Delilah. I never meant for it to go this far. I was just afraid of losing you." She took a deep breath, the weight of his betrayal sinking in. Meredith had been a part of her life's chaos, but the real danger had come from within her own home. Philip, the man she had trusted, had torn her life apart in his own twisted attempt to hold on to her. And as she stood there, looking at the shattered remnants of her life, Delilah realized that there was no going back. She would have to rebuild her world from scratch, but she would do it alone, free from the secrets and lies that had threatened to destroy her. But even in her fury, Delilah couldn't shake the lingering dread. Meredith was still missing, her shadow still lingering over Delilah's life, a haunting reminder that the consequences of her choices were far from over. Twisted confessions. The days that followed felt like a blur. Delilah couldn't shake the disbelief of Philip's confession. Her husband, the man she had trusted, built a life with, and shared 2 children with, had orchestrated the nightmare she'd been living. He'd hired someone to invade their life, to manipulate her, to watch her every move. His actions felt like a complete betrayal, twisting the knife of guilt and paranoia deeper into her already fractured reality. After his confession, Philip tried to apologize, begging her to understand his jealousy and fear. "I was afraid, Delilah. I knew something had changed in you. You seemed distant, secretive. I thought I was losing you." His voice had wavered, his expression pleading. But Delilah felt nothing but a cold emptiness, a vast gulf where their love had once been. She realized that whatever trust had existed between them was now irreparably broken. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this, Philip," she had said quietly. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed our family." He looked down, defeated. "I know, Delilah. I know." But even as she grappled with Philip's betrayal, Delilah couldn't ignore the feeling of unfinished business. Meredith's mysterious disappearance still weighed heavily on her mind, casting a dark shadow over every quiet moment. She had reached out to Detective Lawson, informing him of Philip's confession and asking if it might help in the investigation. Lawson had been surprised but promised to keep her informed. Yet, as the days stretched on, there was no new information. Meredith was still missing, and Delilah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was still in danger. She avoided being alone, constantly checking her surroundings, her nerves fraying more with each passing day. She didn't trust Philip, but for now, he was staying in the house, a painful reminder of their shattered marriage. Then, late one night, Delilah's phone buzzed with an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat. She hesitated, her mind racing with possibilities, but something compelled her to answer. "Hello." There was a pause, a faint sound of breathing, and then a familiar voice. "Delilah." It was Grace. Delilah let out a shaky breath, her relief quickly turning to confusion. Grace sounded different. Her voice was softer, almost broken. "Grace, where have you been? I've been calling you for days." "I'm sorry, Delilah. I needed time to think, to process everything. I didn't know what to say." Delilah felt a pang of hurt but brushed it aside. "There's been so much happening. Grace. Philip. He was behind the threats. He hired someone to spy on me because he thought I was cheating." Grace's silence was heavy, and for a moment, Delilah thought she'd lost the connection. But then Grace whispered, "I know." Delilah froze. "What do you mean, you know?" "I've been trying to tell you. There's something you need to understand. Meredith, she didn't just disappear. I made her leave." The words hit Delilah like a physical blow. "You? What?" Grace took a deep breath, her voice trembling. She wouldn't stop. She kept coming around, threatening us, saying she'd expose everything. "She wanted you gone, Delilah. She said if I didn't end things with you, she'd ruin both our lives." "Grace, why didn't you tell me?" Delilah's voice was barely a whisper, the betrayal cutting her deeply. "I thought I could handle it alone. I met with her that night, the night she disappeared. I begged her to leave us alone, but she wouldn't listen. She said she loved me, that she'd never let me be with anyone else. She was obsessed." Delilah's mind raced, piecing together the terrifying puzzle. "Grace, where is she?" There was another pause, the silence stretching until Delilah's patience snapped. "Grace, tell me the truth." Grace's voice was barely audible. She's gone, Delilah. I told her to leave, that I didn't want her in my life anymore. She finally got in her car and drove away. I haven't seen or heard from her since." But Delilah wasn't convinced. Something in Grace's voice, a lingering guilt, hinted at more. "Grace, you're not telling me everything." Another long silence. Then, finally, Grace spoke, her words slow and deliberate. "After she left, I couldn't stop thinking about her threats. I followed her, just to make sure she wouldn't come back. She was driving toward the cliffs outside town." Delilah's breath caught. She knew the cliffs well. A dangerous, winding road with steep drops and jagged rocks below. It was a place of beauty during the day but treacherous at night. "She didn't see me," Grace continued. "I kept my distance. But then, she lost control. Her car swerved, and she went over the edge. I saw it happen, Delilah." The room spun as Delilah clutched the phone, her voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you tell the police?" I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I thought they'd think I pushed her, that I was responsible. And with everything we'd done, I thought it would destroy us. Delilah was silent, her mind reeling. Grace had watched Meredith's car plunge off the cliff and left her there, leaving Meredith's fate a mystery. She couldn't decide if she felt horror or pity for Grace, whose actions now seemed like the desperate choices of a woman cornered by love, fear, and jealousy. "Delilah," Grace whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I know I should have told you, but I thought I could protect us." Delilah took a shaky breath, her emotions swirling in a mix of anger, sorrow, and understanding. "Grace, we can't keep running from this. We need to go to the police. Together." Grace was silent, but Delilah sensed her reluctance, her fear of the truth finally coming to light. "Delilah, if we go to the police, they'll think we're guilty. They'll think we planned this, that we wanted her gone." "I can't live like this, Grace," Delilah said firmly. "We need to face what happened. I've lost too much already. I can't keep hiding." Reluctantly, Grace agreed. The next morning, they met with Detective Lawson, each word heavy with guilt and remorse, as they recounted the truth of Meredith's disappearance. Delilah spoke first, describing the harassment and threats, Philip's confession, and finally, Grace's heartbreaking account of the accident. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but also strangely liberated. The truth was finally out. Lawson listened intently, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he sat back, crossing his arms as he considered their words. "We'll investigate," he said finally, his tone cautious. "But know this, if there's any evidence of foul play, any indication that Meredith's death wasn't accidental, there will be consequences." Delilah nodded, steeling herself. She had already accepted the consequences of her choices. She'd lost her marriage, her trust in the man she'd once loved, and her once peaceful life. All that remained was the hope that, somehow, she could rebuild from the wreckage. Over the following weeks, the police conducted a thorough investigation. They combed through Meredith's car, checked for signs of tampering, and reviewed surveillance footage from the area. Each day was an agonizing wait, with Delilah and Grace living in the shadow of possible arrest. Then, one evening, Detective Lawson called. Delilah's hands shook as she picked up, bracing herself for whatever news he had. "Delilah," Lawson said, his tone surprisingly gentle, "we've concluded the investigation. There's no evidence to suggest foul play. It appears Meredith's death was a tragic accident." A wave of relief washed over her, followed by a lingering sadness. Meredith's death, though an accident, had left a scar on everyone involved. Delilah knew the shadows of her actions would haunt her, the weight of her choices forever etched into her soul. As she hung up the phone, Delilah walked outside, standing beneath the vast night sky. The stars shimmered above, distant and untouched by the chaos of human lives below. She closed her eyes, feeling a strange peace settle over her. The ordeal had changed her irrevocably, but she was determined to move forward. She would rebuild her life, piece by piece, and perhaps someday she would find forgiveness, not just from others, but from herself. For now, though, she took solace in the silence, the stillness of the night, and the knowledge that, finally, she was free, rebuilding from ruin. In the weeks following the end of the investigation, Delilah struggled to find a sense of normalcy. The truth was out, but the cost of her secrets and lies had left her isolated, her once stable life now fragile and broken. Philip moved out of the house, a quiet separation that bore no formal announcements, just a mutual understanding that their trust had been too deeply shattered to repair. Their children, Max and Ellie, were confused and hurt, their parents' tension and whispers of betrayal creating an invisible wall between them. For Delilah, the hardest part wasn't the empty rooms or the lingering whispers in town. It was the silence, the unending quiet that followed each revelation. Grace had also pulled away, her guilt and sorrow, a heavy burden that seemed to prevent her from fully reconnecting with Delilah. In their brief encounters, they exchanged only a few words, a lingering glance, each knowing the other's pain, but too drained to offer comfort. Delilah was left to piece together her life alone, navigating the wreckage with no clear path forward. One autumn afternoon, she found herself standing in the middle of her living room, staring at the family photographs on the wall. Smiling faces, moments frozen in time, each one now feeling like a relic from a different life. In a sudden rush of emotion, she pulled them all down, leaving empty hooks where their once happy memories had hung. She couldn't bear to look at them anymore. The images felt like a lie, a haunting reminder of the woman she used to be and the life she'd lost. In the emptiness, Delilah found a strange, quiet strength. She started with small routines, simple things that gave her a sense of control. Every morning, she walked through the neighborhood, relishing the cool autumn air, letting the world around her ground her in a reality free from secrets and lies. She joined a local art class, rediscovering a long-buried passion for painting. Her brushes became an outlet, a way to express the storm of emotion she carried inside, each stroke of color freeing a little bit of the pain trapped within her. The art class became her sanctuary, and there she met a new friend, Marta, an older woman with a quick wit and a kindness that softened Delilah's guarded heart. Marta had lived a life of losses herself, a husband, a son to addiction, and a long, lonely stretch of years spent trying to rebuild. She saw the pain in Delilah's eyes and never pressed her for details, offering companionship without questions. For the first time in months, Delilah felt safe enough to let someone in. One day after class, Marta invited Delilah to her cozy, plant-filled apartment for tea. The two women sat in comfortable silence, sipping from warm mugs, the soft hum of Marta's record player filling the room. Marta finally spoke, her voice gentle yet firm. "Pain like yours, it doesn't go away overnight. But you know, life has a way of showing up when you least expect it. You're already stronger than you realized, Delilah. Keep going." Delilah felt tears prick her eyes, a deep gratitude welling up inside her. Marta's words were simple, but they carried a truth she desperately needed to hear. Yet, even as she started to heal, Delilah couldn't completely let go of the memories of Grace. Their friendship, and later their love, had been both a beautiful escape and a path to destruction. She missed Grace deeply, but the memories were tainted now, the joy of their connection dulled by the tragedy of Meredith's death. Her relationship with Grace felt like a wound that wouldn't quite heal, a scar that remained tender no matter how much time passed. One chilly evening, as Delilah walked home from class, she found herself lingering in front of Grace's house. The lights were on, casting a warm glow onto the quiet street. She knew she shouldn't reach out, that they had agreed to keep their distance for the sake of their own healing. But something inside her ached, a longing to make sense of all they'd been through, to find closure, or maybe just understanding. Taking a deep breath, Delilah walked up to the door and knocked. After a few moments, Grace opened it, her face registering surprise and a touch of sadness. She gestured for Delilah to come inside, and the two women sat across from each other in the dimly lit living room, the weight of unspoken words filling the air. "Grace," Delilah began, her voice quiet. "I don't know how to move forward. I keep trying, but it feels like something is missing." Grace nodded, her gaze fixed on her hands. "I know. It's hard to let go of something that meant so much to us, even if it ended in the worst way possible." There was a pause, each of them absorbing the magnitude of what they'd been through together. Then Grace spoke, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "I'm sorry, Delilah. I never wanted any of this to happen. I thought we could find happiness, that maybe we could escape the lies. But I dragged you into something that got out of control." Delilah reached out, placing her hand on Grace's. "We both made mistakes, Grace, and maybe we didn't know how much we would lose. But I don't regret the love we had. I think, in some way, it saved me, even if it hurt too." Grace looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Do you think we'll ever be able to forgive ourselves?" Delilah paused, considering the question carefully. "I don't know if we'll ever fully forgive ourselves, but maybe Maybe we can find a way to live with it, to let it be a part of us, without letting it control us. They sat in silence, their hands entwined, a quiet understanding passing between them. For the first time since Meredith's death, Delilah felt a sense of peace, a gentle easing of the pain that had haunted her for so long. In the days that followed, Delilah continued to rebuild her life, one day at a time. She focused on her art, her friendship with Marta, and her relationship with her children, who were slowly beginning to accept the changes in their family. She poured her energy into her newfound passions, allowing herself to feel joy in small, simple moments. A cup of coffee on a quiet morning, the vibrant colors of a sunset, the laughter of her children filling the house once again. She and Grace remained distant but cordial, an unspoken agreement that their paths had diverged. There was a quiet respect between them now, a mutual understanding that their love, though powerful, had come at too great a cost. They had shared something profound, something that had opened doors to parts of themselves they'd never known before. But now, they each needed space to heal, to grow in ways that their love couldn't allow. One evening, Marta invited Delilah to a community art show, where Delilah's paintings were on display for the first time. As she wandered through the gallery, her heart swelled with pride, the culmination of months of healing and growth captured on canvas. Each painting told a piece of her story, the pain, the loss, the hope. She caught sight of Marta, who winked and gave her a thumbs up from across the room. At that moment, Delilah felt a sense of wholeness she hadn't thought possible. The scars of the past remained, but they were now part of her journey, a testament to her resilience. She knew she couldn't erase what had happened, couldn't undo the choices that had led her to this point, but she had found a way to live with them, to let them be a part of her without defining her. As the evening drew to a close, Delilah stepped outside, feeling the cool night air against her skin. She looked up at the stars, the same stars she'd gazed at in moments of despair, and realized that they looked different now, brighter, somehow, as if the weight of the past had lifted just enough to let her see them clearly. For the first time in months, Delilah felt free, not from her mistakes, but from the fear and guilt that had bound her. She had faced her darkest truths, endured the painful process of healing, and emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. With a final glance at the sky, she turned and walked into the night, her heart lighter, her path clearer. The journey wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. A new dawn. Months passed, and winter descended on Arlington Heights, blanketing the town in a quiet hush. For Delilah, the past year felt like a lifetime, a journey through love, betrayal, tragedy, and finally, redemption. The transformation she'd undergone was visible to everyone around her, especially her children, who had watched their mother's evolution from broken to brave. But as Delilah emerged from the cocoon of her pain, she realized that her story wasn't only about her. It was about rebuilding trust with her children, her community, and herself. Her art had become a conduit for her emotions, and in sharing it, she'd found a renewed purpose. The community art show had been a resounding success, not only for Delilah, but also for Marta, who had watched Delilah's growth with pride. With Marta's encouragement, Delilah began leading a weekly art class for local women looking for a creative outlet. Many of them were mothers, professionals, and retirees who carried their own quiet struggles. In that studio, the women shared their stories through brushstrokes, each piece revealing the unspoken parts of their lives. One evening, after a particularly rewarding class, Delilah lingered behind to clean up, her heart full as she looked at the artwork they'd created together. Marta entered the room, bringing 2 cups of tea, her eyes sparkling with a secretive smile. "Come on," Marta said, patting the chair beside her. "I have a surprise for you." Delilah took a sip of tea, watching Marta with curiosity. "You always know how to keep me guessing." Marta chuckled, setting down her mug. "Well, it's time you shared your work with a bigger audience. There's an exhibit coming up in the city, and I've taken the liberty of entering your name." Delilah's heart skipped a beat. An exhibit? Marta, I don't know if I'm ready for that. You're more than ready, Marta replied, her voice steady and encouraging. People need to see what you've created. Your work speaks to others, Delilah. You've captured the resilience, the strength, and the quiet beauty of a life rebuilt. Her hand shook as she absorbed Marta's words, a mixture of excitement and trepidation. But what if it brings up everything? What if people ask questions? Then tell them your truth, Delilah, Marta said simply. You have nothing to hide anymore. Delilah spent the next few weeks preparing her pieces for the exhibit, each brushstroke a reminder of the journey she'd endured. She selected works that reflected the spectrum of her emotions, paintings of dark storm clouds and violent waves, tender morning light, and hopeful sunsets. She poured herself into each one, knowing they held pieces of her soul. The night of the exhibit arrived, and Delilah stood in the bustling gallery, her art displayed alongside works from other local artists. The room was filled with murmurs of appreciation, the soft glow of lights casting a warm ambience over the canvases. As she moved from painting to painting, memories surfaced, each piece telling the story of the heartbreak, love, and courage that had brought her here. Her children arrived, their faces alight with pride, and she felt a surge of gratitude for their support. Philip had offered to attend, but Delilah had gently declined. Their separation was amicable, and while they shared the bond of co-parenting, Delilah was discovering a life of her own, free from the constraints of their past. The evening wore on, and just as Delilah was beginning to relax, a familiar figure entered the gallery. Grace stood in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room until they met Delilah's. Her presence was a shock, yet strangely comforting, a reminder of all they had survived. Grace approached her, her expression soft. I couldn't miss this, she said quietly. You've come so far, Delilah. Delilah's heart swelled with a bittersweet emotion. I couldn't have done it without you. We went through so much together. They stood side by side, absorbing the weight of their shared history. After a moment, Delilah reached for Grace's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. I've forgiven myself, Grace, and I hope you've forgiven yourself too. Grace nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I have. It's taken time, but I've learned to accept everything. The good, the bad, all of it. They shared a quiet smile, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Grace was part of her past, a chapter she had loved fiercely and left behind with Grace. They would always share the memory of their bond, but each had found the strength to move forward, carrying the lessons with them. After Grace left, Delilah wandered the gallery, taking in the responses of the guests. She noticed a young woman lingering by one of her darker pieces, a tumultuous sea painted in deep shades of blue and black, with a faint glimmer of light on the horizon. The woman looked up, meeting Delilah's gaze. This one, it speaks to me, she murmured. I can feel the sadness, the hope. It's beautiful. Delilah smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Thank you. I created it during a time when I didn't know if I'd ever find peace, but there's always a way forward, even when it feels impossible. The woman nodded, her expression thoughtful. Thank you for sharing that. It gives me hope. As the evening drew to a close, Delilah left the gallery feeling a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. She had shared her journey with strangers, opening herself to their understanding and empathy. Her story had touched others, becoming something greater than herself, a symbol of resilience and rebirth. In the months that followed, Delilah continued to expand her art classes, reaching more women in the community. The classes became a gathering place for those looking to heal, express, and connect. Delilah shared her story openly, and in turn, others shared theirs, creating a circle of trust and understanding that strengthened her even more. As spring approached, her life took on a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. Her children were thriving, their smiles coming more easily, their trust slowly rebuilding. Philip, though no longer part of her life in the same way, remained a supportive co-parent, and they worked together to provide stability for their children. The past was still there, a quiet shadow, but it no longer controlled her. One sunny afternoon, as she strolled through her neighborhood, she stopped in front of her old house. The memories flooded back, but they no longer hurt. Instead, they felt like distant echoes, reminders of a life that had shaped her but didn't define her. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see a message from Marta. "Tea at my place. I have new plant babies to show off." Delilah laughed, her heart light. She typed a quick response and began walking toward Marta's apartment, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. Her life, once filled with shadows and secrets, was now illuminated by the simple joys she'd found in friendship, family, and creativity. As she arrived at Marta's apartment, Delilah paused, gazing up at the clear blue sky. She had lost so much, yet she had gained a depth and strength she hadn't known she possessed. Each step of her journey had taught her to embrace her scars, to find beauty in the broken parts, and to move forward with an open heart. Marta opened the door, grinning as she ushered Delilah inside. They spent the afternoon laughing, drinking tea, and marveling over Marta's new plants. In that moment, surrounded by friendship and the quiet happiness of a life rebuilt, Delilah felt truly whole. Her past would always be a part of her story, but it was no longer her only story. She was free to create, to live, to love, and to dream, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, she had the strength to face it.